I need you to understand something before I begin. I am not a writer. I don't know how to craft a perfect hook, and I certainly don't know how to make myself look good in this story. I am typing this on an old mechanical Lenovo laptop with 3 missing keys, sitting on the kitchen floor because it's the only spot in this godforsaken house where the floorboards don't groan when I shift my weight. If you're looking for a polished horror novel, close this tab. But if you want to know why the entire eastern block of Oakhaven Road has been completely abandoned since last October, stay. Just promise me one thing. If you hear it while reading this, do not look at the door. It started on a Tuesday. It's funny how the worst things in your life always seem to pick a mundane weekday. It was October 14th, raining that miserable, freezing kind of sleet that blurs the streetlights into greasy yellow smudges. My name is Arthur. At the time, I was working a remote data entry job that paid just enough to keep me in instant coffee and cheap cigarettes. I lived alone in a small, rented cottage that sat at the very edge of the woods. It was cheap, isolated, and quiet. Exactly what an introverted 26-year-old thought he wanted. At exactly 3:14 a.m., I was staring at a spreadsheet when the first knock came. Knock. It wasn't a frantic pounding, nor was it the polite tap of a neighbor. It was a heavy, deliberate strike against the solid oak of my front door. A single, solitary hit. I froze. My mouse cursor hovered over a cell block. In a small town like this, nobody comes to your door at 3 in the morning unless someone is dead or a car has flipped into the ditch by the main road. I waited, my heart doing a sudden violent thud against my ribs. I braced myself for the inevitable follow-up. In every normal human interaction, a knock is repeated. Knock, knock, knock. It's a rhythm we learn as children, but nothing happened. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock down the hallway seemed to grow louder, filling the space where the sound had been, leaking into the kitchen. I stood up, my knees cracking loudly in the quiet room. I crept toward the hallway, the hardwood cold beneath my socks. The cottage was dark save for the pale blue glow radiating from my monitor behind me. I reached the front door and pressed my ear against the cold wood. Nothing, not even the sound of the wind. I reached for the deadbolt, my fingers wrapping around the cold brass. I was about to turn it when a sudden, visceral wave of nausea hit me. It wasn't physical sickness. It was an instinct. It was the primal, lizard brain alarm system that tells an animal to stop moving when a predator is near. Every hair on my arms stood straight up. I didn't open the door. Instead, I looked through the tiny, scratched peephole. The porch light was on, casting a harsh, bug-swarmed glare over the concrete steps. The porch was completely empty. The rain was coming down in sheets, dancing off the railing. There were no wet footprints on the concrete. There was no shadow moving away into the dark yard. There was absolutely nothing. I took a deep breath, cursing my overactive imagination. Just a bird, I muttered to myself, though I knew no bird could hit an oak door with that kind of mass, or a branch. I went back to my desk, but the flow of my work was broken. I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence outside wasn't empty. It felt attentive, like the darkness beyond my windows was leaning in, listening to the sound of my breathing. I finally managed to fall asleep on the couch around 5 a.m., leaving the lights on. The next day, I forgot about it. The daylight has a way of making nighttime terrors look foolish. I went to the local grocery store, bought some groceries, and even chatted with old Mr. Henderson, who lived about a quarter mile down the road. He looked tired, his eyes bloodshot and heavily bagged. I almost asked him if he'd heard anything strange the night before, but I didn't want to sound like a paranoid city transplant. I wish to God I had asked him. I wish I had listened to the gravelly, exhausted tone of his voice before everything went quiet. The second night Wednesday, the storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, freezing fog that swallowed the trees. I went to bed early, around midnight, determined to get my sleep schedule back on track. I woke up instantly. No grogginess, no transition from a dream, just wide-eyed, sudden alertness. I looked at the digital clock on my nightstand, 3:14 a.m. A second later, it came. Knock. It was the exact same sound, same pitch, same heavy, dead thud against the oak. It felt less like a hand hitting wood and more like a solid block of stone being dropped against it. This time, Anger flared up through my fear. Kids. It had to be the teenagers from the high school 2 miles over, playing some messed up version of Ding Dong Ditch in the fog. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from my bedside drawer and marched down the hallway, not bothering to be quiet. I wanted them to hear me coming. I wanted to catch them in the act. I reached the door, threw my hand onto the deadbolt, and twisted it. The lock clicked open with a sharp, metallic snap. I grabbed the handle and pulled the door wide open, stepping out onto the porch with the flashlight raised like a club. "Hey! Who's out there?" I shouted into the fog. The flashlight beam cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but drifting white vapor. The front yard was a blank canvas of gray. The gravel driveway was empty. My car sat under the carport, a silent metal ghost. I stepped to the edge of the porch, the cold air biting through my t-shirt. I shone the light down at the steps. My breath caught in my throat. The porch steps were dry, shielded by the awning. But right there, on the very top step, directly in front of my door, was a puddle of thick, blackish-green water. It smelled faintly of stagnant river mud and something sweet, like copper mixed with rotting lilies. And in the center of that puddle was a print. It wasn't a footprint. It looked like the impression of a massive, naked human palm. But the fingers were far too long, ending in blunt, circular tips that had pressed deep into the grime. I stumbled backwards, slamming the door shut and throwing the deadbolt back into place. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam casting long, erratic shadows up the walls. I backed away from the door, my eyes locked on the wood. I retreated all the way into the kitchen, grabbing a long carving knife from the block. I sat on the floor, the knife held tightly in both hands, staring at the hallway. I stayed like that for 2 hours. The house was dead quiet. Then, at exactly 5:15 a.m., my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The sudden noise made me screech aloud. I crept over and looked at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown 10-digit number. The message contained no words. It was just a low-resolution photograph. The photo was taken from outside my house. It was shot from the edge of the woods, looking directly at my kitchen window. In the glass, you could clearly see the reflection of the pale blue light from my computer monitor in the other room. But what made my stomach drop into a bottomless void was the silhouette standing right in front of the glass on the outside. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with unnaturally long, thin arms that hung down past its knees. It wasn't looking at the window, it was looking sideways, toward the front porch, as if it was waiting. Beneath the photo, a second text popped up a minute later. "You opened it on the first. Do not answer the second knock." I didn't sleep for the rest of that Thursday. When the sun finally rose, casting a weak gray light through the fog, I didn't feel safe. The daylight no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a spotlight. I sat on the kitchen floor until my legs went entirely numb, staring at the text message on my phone until the screen burned into my retinas. "You opened it on the first. Do not answer the second knock." Who sent it? Who was watching my house? I tried calling the number back, but a flat, automated operator voice instantly informed me that the number was no longer in service. I tried tracing the IP routing through a friend who worked in IT, but he told me the text had bypassed standard carrier towers entirely, originating from an unidentifiable digital ghost signal. By noon, the isolation was suffocating. I needed to see another human face. I needed to know I hadn't completely lost my mind. I threw on a heavy coat, pocketed the carving knife, which felt incredibly pathetic against whatever was in that photograph, and drove down to Mr. Henderson's place. When I pulled into his gravel driveway, I noticed his truck was parked crookedly, one of the front wheels resting in his prized flower bed. The front door to his house was wide open, swinging slightly in the damp breeze. "Mr. Henderson?" I called out, stepping onto his porch. My heart was already hammering against my ribs. The house smelled awful. It was that same smell from my porch the night before, stagnant river mud and rotting lilies, but much thicker, much heavier. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my boots. The living room was a disaster. Books were knocked off the shelves, a floor lamp was shattered on the rug, and the television was on, displaying nothing but static that hissed loudly in the empty house. I found him in the kitchen. Mr. Henderson was sitting at his dining table, his back to me. For a second, relief washed over me. Mr. Henderson, thank God. Your front door was open, and I stopped. He hadn't moved. He didn't even stiffen at the sound of my voice. I walked around the table slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for my knife. When I saw his face, the breath left my lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. He was alive, but he wasn't. There. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the wall ahead of him, the pupils completely dilated until his eyes looked like two black holes. His skin was a deathly translucent gray, and his mouth was stretched open in a silent, jaw-locking scream. But the worst part was his ears. A thin, dark trickle of dried, greenish-black blood had leaked from both of his ear canals, staining his collar. On the wooden table in front of him, written in the same thick, foul-smelling slime I'd seen on my porch, were 3 words repeated over and over until the wood was soaked. I answered it. I answered it. I answered it. I don't remember driving back to my cottage. I just remember the blur of the gray trees and the screaming engine of my car. I didn't call the police. Who would believe me? What would I tell them? That Mr. Henderson had been frightened into a catatonic state by a noise. By the time I locked myself back inside my own home, the sun was already dipping below the tree line. The shadows were lengthening, stretching across the floor like long, thin fingers. I spent the afternoon turning my house into a fortress. I dragged the heavy oak dresser from my bedroom and wedged it against the front door. I moved the kitchen table against the back door. I nailed the windows shut, hammering the nails in with a frantic, desperate fury until my hands were bleeding. I knew what the text meant now. The thing that came to my house didn't just knock to be let in. It was a test, a trap. The first knock was a summons. It was meant to make you open the door, to make you acknowledge its presence, to break the barrier between the outside and the inside. But the second knock was the execution. By 9 p.m., the house was completely sealed. I sat in the exact center of the living room, away from every window, away from every wall. I had a loaded 12-gauge shotgun, an old relic my father had left me, resting across my knees. Beside me was a thermos of black coffee and 3 flashlights with fresh batteries. The silence returned, heavier than before. It felt thick, almost pressurized, like the air inside a diving bell deep underwater. The fog outside had grown so dense that it pressed flat against the window panes, erasing the world beyond the glass. There was no Oakhaven Road anymore. There was only my house, floating in a white, silent void. 1 a.m. passed, then 2 a.m. My eyes were burning from the strain of staring into the shadows. Every tiny sound, the settling of the house, the click of the refrigerator compressor, made me jump so hard the shotgun nearly slipped from my sweat-slicked hands. Then came 3:13 a.m. I watched the digital clock on my phone. The numbers seemed to glow with a malicious intensity. 3:13, 3:14. The air in the room instantly turned ice cold. My breath plumed into white clouds in front of my face. In the hallway, the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock didn't just stop. Its pendulum froze mid-swing, sticking to the side of the wooden case as if held by a magnet. Knock. The sound didn't come from the front door this time. It came from the floorboards right beneath my feet. It was a single, heavy, resonant thud. The vibration shook the floorboards, traveling up through the soles of my shoes and rattling my teeth. It felt like something massive was buried alive under my house, striking the bottom of the wood with its fist. I scrambled backwards, screaming, dropping the shotgun. I dragged myself into the corner of the room, my back pressed hard against the intersecting drywall. "Go away," I shrieked, my voice cracking. "Go away." Silence. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. My heart was beating so fast I thought my chest would crack open. I forced myself to breathe, inhaling the freezing, stagnant air. It hadn't knocked a second time. The rule was holding. Do not answer the second knock. But how could I answer a knock that came from beneath the floor? What did answering even mean anymore? Then the phone in my pocket vibrated. I pulled it out with a hand so shaky I almost dropped it. It was another text from the unknown number. I opened it, my eyes tearing up from the cold. It was a video file. I pressed play with a trembling thumb. The video was completely dark at first, accompanied by a heavy, wet breathing sound. Then, a small light flickered on. The camera was moving through a cramped, dirt-walled tunnel. It was crawling, The camera tilted up and I saw concrete foundation pillars. It was the crawl space beneath my house. The camera moved closer to the wooden subfloor above it. Then the view shifted, turning around to face whoever was holding the phone. The flashlight beam caught a pale, hairless, elongated face. It had no nose, just two vertical slits, and its eyes were completely absent, replaced by smooth, unbroken skin. But it had a mouth. A wide, lipless slit that stretched from ear to ear. As I watched, the mouth split open, revealing rows of thin, needle-like black teeth. It wasn't a smile. It was a mimicry of a human expression. The creature raised a long, skeletal hand, its elongated fingers tipped with those blunt, circular pads. It pressed one finger against its lipless mouth in a universal sign for silence. Shh! Then it lowered its hand, pointed the camera directly at the wooden beam above its head, and lifted its fist. In the video, I saw its fist strike the wood. In the real world, at that exact microsecond, the second knock came. Knock! It exploded right beneath me. The floorboards split open, shooting splinters of wood into the air. A stench of pure rot and copper flooded the room, so thick I instantly gagged and threw up onto the rug. But the knock didn't stop there. Suddenly from the front door, knock. From the boarded-up kitchen window, knock. From the ceiling directly above my head, knock. It wasn't a rhythm anymore. It was an avalanche of sound, a synchronized bombardment from every direction, closing in on the living room. The house was screaming under the pressure, the drywall cracking, the nails I had pounded into the windows popping out like bullets. And then, amid the deafening cacophony of the blows, my phone rang. Not a text, a direct voice call. The caller ID displayed my own name, Arthur. The phone in my hand felt heavier than the shotgun. It vibrated with a rhythmic, mechanical violence that seemed to match the pounding against the walls of my house. Arthur. My own name stared back at me from the glowing screen. I wanted to fling the device across the room, to smash it against the brick fireplace until it was nothing but wires and glass. But my thumb, possessed by a desperate, terrifying curiosity, slid across the glass. I accepted the call. I held the phone to my ear. At first, there was only the sound of the storm outside, or what I thought was the storm. It was a wet, heavy rushing sound, like a deep river flowing through a cavern. Then, the background noise faded, replaced by a sound that made my bladder go completely weak. It was the sound of typing, the distinct plastic clack of a mechanical Lenovo laptop with loose keys. Clack, 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 clack. Hello? I whispered, my voice barely a thread of air. The typing stopped instantly. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, a dead vacuum that seemed to suck the warmth right out of my ear. Then, a voice spoke. It was my voice. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't a generic imitation. It had the exact nasality, the same slight rasp from my smoking habit, the precise cadence of my speech. But the tone was wrong. It was entirely flat, devoid of any human inflection, as if a machine were using my vocal cords like strings on a puppet. I am sitting on the kitchen floor, my voice said from the receiver, because it's the only spot in this god-forsaken house where the floorboards don't groan when I shift my weight. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Those were the exact words I had thought to myself just hours ago. Those were the thoughts I hadn't even spoken aloud. "Who are you?" I screamed into the phone, the terror finally breaking through my paralysis. "What do you want from me?" "Do not answer the second knock," the voice replied. "I didn't." I sobbed, tears blurring my vision as the house around me continued to shake under the relentless bombardment of thuds. Knock. Knock, knock. The ceiling was sagging now, the plaster raining down in white dust over my shoulders. "I didn't open the door. I locked everything. I didn't answer it." "You answered the call," my voice said softly. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Answering. It didn't just mean opening a wooden door. It meant acknowledgement. It meant validation. By picking up the phone, by engaging with it, I had let it in. I had completed the circuit. The phone went dead. The screen flickered black. At that exact second, the frantic, deafening pounding around the house stopped completely. The sudden absence of sound was violent. It felt like being dropped from a cliff into deep water. The air in the room was so cold now that my skin felt brittle, like old paper. Then, from the hallway, came a new sound. It wasn't a knock. It was the slow, agonizing sound of the heavy oak dresser, the one I had wedged tightly against the front door, being pushed across the hardwood floor. Screech. It moved an inch, then another. The screech of wood against wood tore through the silence like a razor blade. Something outside was pushing against the door, and the massive weight of my furniture was doing nothing to stop it. I scrambled on my hands and knees toward the corner, grabbing the 12-gauge shotgun. I fumbled with the breech, ensuring a shell was chambered. My hands were so slick with sweat and vomit that the cold steel nearly slipped from my grip. I raised the barrel, aiming it down the dark hallway. The deadbolt on the front door gave a loud, metallic crack as the mechanism sheared straight through the frame. The door swung open, casting a long shaft of foggy gray moonlight into the house. A silhouette stood in the doorway. It was exactly as it appeared in the photograph, but worse, far worse, in the flesh. It was impossibly tall, its hairless, elongated torso leaning forward at a grotesque angle to clear the doorframe. Its limbs were thin as saplings, bending at joints that seemed to have too many hinges. It didn't walk, it glided, its long, skeletal legs moving with a sickening spider-like fluidness. It entered the hallway. The smell of rotting lilies and old copper became so overpowering that I couldn't breathe. My eyes watered, burning from the chemical stench. "Stop right there," I yelled, but it came out as a pathetic squeak. The creature didn't stop. It tilted its head sideways, its smooth, featureless face catching the moonlight. Where its eyes should have been, there were only shallow, fleshy hollows that twitched beneath the skin, as if something were swimming underneath. I pulled the trigger. The blast from the shotgun was blinding in the dark house. The roar deafened me, leaving a high-pitched ring in my ears. The blast hit the creature squarely in the chest. I saw its gray flesh tear open, but there was no red blood. Instead, a thick, gelatinous black sludge oozed from the wound, smelling of old swamp water. The creature didn't even stumble. It didn't register the pain. It simply stopped for a fraction of a second, looked down at its ruptured chest, and then looked back up at me. The wide, lipless slit of its mouth split open. It didn't scream. It began to mimic the sound of the shotgun blast. Boom! The sound came out of its throat with the exact, terrifying volume of the real weapon, shaking the pictures off the walls. Then it began to change the sound. It shifted from the blast to the sound of my own voice, screaming in the kitchen from the night before. "Go away! Go away!" The creature shrieked using my own voice, its long arms reaching out toward me, the blunt circular fingers twitching in the air. I dropped the gun. There was no point. I backed myself into the corner as far as I could, my spine pressing against the drywall until it cracked. The creature glided across the living room, hovering over me. It was so close I could feel the unnatural, freezing radiation of its body. It reached down. One of its long, cold fingers pressed against my right ear. The blunt pad felt like a wet stone. "I answered it," the creature whispered, using Mr. Henderson's gravelly, exhausted tone, the exact voice I remembered from the grocery store. A blinding, white-hot agony exploded inside my skull. It felt as if someone had poured liquid fire directly into my ear canal. I tried to scream, but the sound was choked out by the sheer intensity of the pain. My vision began to fail, turning into a blur of gray and black static. I could feel something heavy, something thick and cold being poured into my head, overriding my mind, locking my physical body into a permanent frozen prison. It didn't erase who I was. It did something much worse. It left my mind entirely intact, a helpless spectator trapped deep inside my own skull while it took the keys to my body. If you are reading this, I am still in the cottage on Oakhaven Road. The sun has risen and set many times, I think, though the fog never truly leaves the windows. The neighbors are gone. The town is quiet. I'm watching my own hands type this on my old Lenovo laptop. My consciousness is buried deep inside, a screaming prisoner behind my own eyes, unable to stop the fingers from moving. My fingers feel strange now, longer than they used to be, the tips blunt and smooth, leaving greasy green marks on the keys. I can see my reflection in the dark screen when it blinks. I don't look like Arthur anymore. My eyes are gone, replaced by smooth, twitching gray flesh. The entity using my hands is writing this because it wants to. It likes the echo. It likes when people read the story, because when you read it, you think about the knock. And when you think about the knock, you listen for it. Your awareness is the bridge it means. I can hear someone walking up my driveway right now, or maybe they're walking up yours. If you hear a single heavy thud against your door tonight, do not be like me. Do not look through the peephole. Do not check the windows. Do not look at your phone when it rings. Because if you answer the first, the second one will not be a knock on the door. It will be a knock on the inside of your skull, asking to be let out.